All right, we are now recording. Hello and welcome to Surviving the Slow Apocalypse, a Wastelander's Guide to Climate Change, presentation put out by the Northeastern Program for Teaching by Undergraduates. We take as the starting premise of this class that we cannot save the world, that climate change by this point is too far gone for us as a species to curtail it. We've kicked off natural feedback loops at this point. Our climate change over the next 50 years or so is likely going to be driven by natural feedback loops as much as by human activity. For example, the melting of the Arctic and subarctic permafrost leads to the decomposition of organisms that were essentially fossilized or mummified there. That releases a lot of methane and carbon dioxide and puts out more than humans actually can. And even if the scientific or technical problem of being able to stop climate change, to halt our carbon emissions, were soluble, it is essential to those in power that we not. However, I do believe that we can save ourselves. That the end of the world doesn't necessarily mean the end of a safe and comfortable existence for people living in it. And that's good enough for me. So let's start with what we're expecting. We're expecting this to be a slow apocalypse driven by climate change. So what are the climatic effects of climate change that we can begin to expect? The first is increased temperatures. A lot of people don't talk about this one very much because a lot of the time the extreme weather that climate change has been manifesting as results in extreme cold as well as extreme heat. But in large portions of the world, particularly the equatorial band, we are going to see heat indexes of up to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you refer to the notes provided, you will notice that heat index is the measure of kind of how hot it feels. Above 130 degrees Fahrenheit heat index, humans cannot thermoregulate by sweating, and we die simply by being outside. Rising seas. Of course, every major city will drown because every major city is on a coast. We already knew this. This was kind of one of those stereotypical ones that you see in the media portrayals of climate change. Or you're going to see long drought, years long, extending to permanent desertification in certain regions. California just ended a 5-year-long drought. The southern Mediterranean could become flat desert, essentially. Famine related to the above drought. It has been calculated that roughly every 1 degree Celsius of warming translates to a 10% loss in global agricultural productivity. We are currently staring down the barrel of 4.6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, according to the IPCC report, which is notoriously conservative in their estimates, which would mean a 46% loss of global agricultural productivity. Related to the famine and the drought and the rising seas, war. We're expecting conflict to increase by up to 50% over this century. That's not really something that Americans have a lot of experience with. Most of our experience with armed conflict has been overseas. The invasions of Iraq, the war in Vietnam. But to put conflict into perspective, a conflict on the scale of the Northern Irish Troubles in the United States would kill 7 million people and maim an additional 30. Something on the scale of the Syrian Civil War would kill 11 million people and displace 2/3 of the country. Resource shortage seems pretty self-explanatory. We are running out of non-renewable resources, such as petroleum. And as a result of all of this, a permanent recession. A 4 degrees Celsius increase in warming will see close to roughly a 30% reduction in the global gross domestic product. If you want a kind of general overview of all of this that's a little less itemized, David Wallace Wells published an article in New York Magazine called The Uninhabitable Earth, and he has a book of the same title that I would strongly recommend. So what exactly do we mean by a slow apocalypse? We mean that this is going to look more like the fall of Rome or the Bronze Age collapse and less like Fallout or Mad Max. There's not going to be a single event that delineates pre- and post-apocalypse. This is going to be a slow process of change over our entire lifetimes. I've been thinking, when I created this class, mostly over a 50-year timescale, give or take. Halfway through the century, 3/4 of the way through the century. Like the spread of our current world order of capitalism, of the state, the modern nation state, its collapse will be neither global nor instantaneous nor even complete. Even today, there are certain areas where that world order really does not touch. Further reading on this, again, The Uninhabitable Earth, and a piece by the name of Desert. It was anonymously published. You can find it at readdesert.org. That is not a joke. So what's this all mean for us? For, you and me? What this means is that over the next half century or so, we can expect increasing disruptions in the delivery of basic goods and services. We can expect price shocks, we can expect shortages of goods, or simple unavailability. We're seeing that right now with coronavirus, where we are seeing shortages and simple unavailability of paper goods, because everyone decided to stock up on toilet paper for some reason. You will no longer be able to depend on the global network of trade and logistics for the provision of goods and services. This is more important than you might think. Tracing the path of any manufactured good, everything from a simple pencil all the way out to the computer that I'm recording this on, involves a logistics network spanning the globe. We will also no longer be able to count on economic security or, in some cases, even physical security. We will need to provide for ourselves and defend ourselves. So what can we do with this? This is all very doom and gloom. What can we do? What's concrete that we can do? Simply, we can prepare. We can learn the life ways whereby we can provide for ourselves and each other to enjoy a safe and reasonably comfortable existence. Put simply, we can learn to live in ways that are, 1, sustainable, in the most literal sense, that is, able to be sustained ad infinitum. The sustainable label often gets thrown on all kinds of, sustainable growth products. It's really just greenwashing. We'll get more into what I mean by that, but think in the most literal sense. Secondly, resilient. That is to say, these are lifeways that are able to withstand shocks and changes to that global network. And third, autonomous, that we'll be able to, live this way on our own without external command or input. So to kind of understand that better, here's a comparison between two ways of producing power for your home. The first is a nuclear power station, and the second is a wood gas generator. The nuclear power station is fueled by uranium mined from a finite supply. It is not sustainable. Although nuclear power is the second cleanest power source on the planet in terms of grams of CO2 per megawatt hour, it's second only to wind, it is not sustainable because it's powered by uranium. There's a finite amount of uranium on the planet. That fuel must be refined and transported to a power plant. The replacement parts, if anything in this power station should break, are specialized and hard to make. This power station here is the Ignalina nuclear power plant. Nuclear graphite is really hard to make. It is not resilient. Third, it requires specialized and advanced knowledge to operate and maintain. If your backyard nuclear reactor breaks, you can't just go down to the corner nuclear physicist and get him to take a look at it. By comparison, and I fucked up the transition on this because I don't know. By comparison, our wood gas generator here is fueled by wood or other biomass, which can be grown in your backyard. The fuel can be gathered, processed, and transported by hand, and replacement parts for the system are easily fabricated. It is resilient. Even if changes in global markets mean that, you can't buy a new generator, you can certainly scavenge the parts pretty easily or fabricate them. And the skills needed to repair and operate this can be learned easily or specialists found locally. You can go down to a mechanic and get him to take a look at your Jenny. So now that we kind of understand what we're looking at, let's talk about the first and most important component of survival, which is other people. What exactly is human nature? You've probably heard the authoritarian argument that humans are naturally competitive, that we're all just cutthroat bastards who are out to get one another. That's not true, put simply. Inasmuch as human nature does exist, it tends toward cooperation rather than competition. Human behavior, on the other hand, is dependent on circumstance. In a society in which cutthroats win, people will be cutthroats. This is borne out in both our own lives and in the archaeological record. In our own lives, we're seeing this already with the coronavirus outbreak. Probably the most common sentence I've heard from my neighbors is, "I'm going to the store, do you need anything?" Providing for one another, making sure that we can all get through this. But this is also in the archaeological record with a finding by the name of Shanidar I, who was a Neanderthal male who was deeply disabled. By the kind of social Darwinist definition, he would not be able to provide for the tribe. He had all kinds of congenital issues. He had an amputation. He was probably deaf and a good chunk of the way to blind. But despite that, he lived to Paleolithic old age. He was in his mid-40s to mid-50s when he died, which for Neanderthals was old age, which suggested, in fact guaranteed, that the only reason he made it that far was because other members of his group supported him. Our desire to help one another literally predates anatomical modernity. This was also, written out in Peter Kropotkin's book Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, which essentially posited that cooperation is as much a factor in the evolution of life on Earth as competition. And today, modern biologists recognize it as nearly as foundational as the origin of species to understanding evolutionary biology. But if you don't buy all that and you really need a self-interested reason for cooperating, it's that competition is risky. Fights are dangerous. This is a simple fact that a lot of people don't realize. In movies and in video games, the protagonists usually walk away from a fight unscathed or with wounds that are easily healed. This is not the case. Simply put, being able to land a punch that can break bone sounds really great until you remember Newton's third law and the fact that you are also made of bone. The fact is that in real fights, street fights, or armed fights, combat, you're just as likely to lose as to win, and both parties usually walk away injured, assuming they walk away at all. Community is the single most important factor of surviving any extreme situation. A really effective formation for that kind of community is an affinity group, a group of between 4 and 12 friends. For example, a Dungeons & Dragons party, where everyone has their own skills and abilities, and they all come together to accomplish a common goal. Friend networks, coworkers, co-conspirators, church groups, neighbors, these can all constitute affinity groups. The fact of the matter is, you really can't go it alone. Max Rokitansky, that masculine ideal of the lone survivor who pulls himself up by the bootstraps, Max is going to die. He's going to be this skeleton on the side of the road by Monday. Humans are social creatures out of necessity. We as individuals will not have all of the necessary skills to survive. We simply can't contain all of that knowledge, and we don't have all of that labor power. Far and away, the best protection you have in any emergency is community, is knowing people, is having people around you who you protect and who protect you in turn. Because a group has the knowledge and the labor power that an individual doesn't. Even if you are the hypothetical perfect survivor, you need to go to sleep at some point. Having a group means that someone else is going to be watching to make sure that no one ambushes your camp in the middle of the night. Community is the single most important tool to survive any catastrophe. I cannot emphasize this enough, because survival, like freedom, is a collective endeavor. Either we do it together or we don't do it at all. So, now that we have friends together, let's talk about our, kind of our most important primary need, which is to feed ourselves, feed and water ourselves. Clean and running water, I don't think I need to explain to you why that's important, but I'm going to anyway. You need to drink. Staying hydrated is important. You need it for cooking, for washing, for making things a lot of time. A lot of manufacturing processes rely on water for lubrication and cooling, and it's often a component of home heating, which we'll get into a little more later. Your primary sources, aside from, town water mains, which I would recommend staying off of because they are not resilient or autonomous, wells, rainwater catchment, and natural bodies of water. You need to be careful, though, because rainwater catchment, while it's great and free, can carry runoff or deposit pollutants from acid rain or from your roof and deposit that into your water. Natural bodies and wells can be contaminated. With what? Well, water carries two major health risks, pollutants and pathogens. Pollutants need to be filtered out, and pathogens need to be boiled out, chemically or radiologically cleaned. Thankfully, these are both pretty easily solved problems. You can build a water filter at home with a 5-gallon bucket and layering sand and charcoal in that bucket. Dirty water goes out the top, clean water comes out the bottom. Pop quiz, why do water towers exist? There's no one here for me to call on because this is an online lecture. The answer is water pressure. Municipalities use water towers to provide water pressure in emergencies. If, for whatever reason, the town water pumps are down, the water pressure is still maintained. So you can still turn on the tap and get water because, when you raise water, when you elevate water, it wants to flow downhill. So we have water. Let's talk about food. My preferred method for getting food would be something called permaculture. This is a portmanteau of permanent agriculture. The idea is to create, instead of a monocrop, instead of simply planting a field with amber waves of grain and nothing else, and the idea is instead to create a micro-ecosystem. You use a number of perennial and mutually supportive crops planted in the same area. This is essentially a terrarium that makes food. It requires a fair amount of planning, but very little maintenance work because nature kind of does the work for you. Industrial agriculture is very much not resilient. A monocrop is not resilient. It needs to be fertilized. Because having a single crop in the entire field will leach whatever that plant needs out of the soil and leave nothing else. It needs pest control because if, any insect or pathogen that feeds on your wheat, if that gets in your field, the whole field is pretty open to infection. This isn't the case with a permaculture system where, for example, your citrus tree here, just because you have something in the garden that preys on citrus doesn't mean that your food supply is screwed, because this same field has maize, it has eggplant, it has okra and banana, things that presumably this pest will not feed on. The relationship to nature with a permaculture setup is one of symbiosis rather than domination. You're not plowing over the land and destroying all the life that's there and planting whatever you want and forcibly keeping everything else out. You kind of let nature take its course and you nudge it in a direction that provides food or fuel to you. Unfortunately, we live in a colder climate. Growing food is kind of hard in colder climates like ours. Greenhouses are a great solution to this. They can extend the growing season by months. But traditional glass houses are uninsulated and require constant heating as a result. This is really energy intensive, it's really carbon intensive, it is a pain. So the solution is this Chinese designed solar greenhouse. This is a passive solar greenhouse. You will notice that the side walls here, and indeed the back wall, 3 of these walls are made of earth, packed earth or brick, which retain heat very well. And that open south side, which can be covered in plastic or in glass, you'll notice there's a mat running along the top here, a rolled up mat that's rolled down and covered at night to retain heat. This allows the inside of the solar greenhouse to be kept about 45 degrees warmer than the outside without any external heating, even in the winter, even in the dead of winter in latitudes equal to New England. So what about animal ag? Ethical qualms aside, there's a lot of use to be had from animal agriculture. The big advantage with animals is that they can turn things that we can't eat into things that we can. A lot of, sheep and cattle farming is on land that's not really suited to growing grain or vegetables. Well, Your sheep and goats and chickens and cows can turn those grasses that you can't eat into beef and chicken that you can. As a general rule with animal agriculture, you're going to want to think medieval. Just about every animal kept during the medieval period had products besides meat. Sheep had wool. Cows had milk, which could be used for all kinds of dairy products. Chickens had eggs. Meat was very expensive in the medieval period, and indeed throughout pretty much all of human history up until mid-20th century America, because raising animals just to kill and eat them requires a lot of resources, and it's not an efficient use of those resources. A number of animals, all of the animals you're going to want to look at, things like sheep or alpaca or chickens or pigs, all of these animals are either multi-use or easy to feed or both. Pig was pretty much the only animal that was raised exclusively for its meat in medieval Europe, because pigs will eat anything. Everything else, you wouldn't eat the chicken, you would eat the eggs. You wouldn't eat the cow, you would drink the milk. It may also be wise to consider raising niche or more unusual livestock, because, again, this is going to be a process of change over the course of our lifetime, so bringing animals to market might be a valuable and important thing for you. Alpaca wool is a lot more valuable than sheep's wool, for example. So raising more niche livestock, might be better suited to the climatic conditions in your area. Alpaca, were raised in the Andes Mountains. They were domesticated in the Andes Mountains, so surviving in the mountains of Vermont would be easy, and their wool is a lot more valuable. So you can get a lot more money out of the same resource input. So once we have a source of food, we then need a source of shelter. We need to house ourselves. There are 5 primary needs of any shelter. Your shelter needs to be dry, it needs to be defensible, warm, fire-resistant, and clean. First off, it has to be dry. You should seek to maintain good drainage to build your shelter on high ground and have a good solid roof over your head. This will all help to keep moisture out of your space, which will prevent mold and improve morale. An important note vis-a-vis the high ground is that you want to be careful not to skyline yourself, which comes into defensibility. Skylining yourself is what happens when you stand at the crest of a hill at dusk, in which your silhouette is very clearly outlined against the sky, against the still bright sky, which makes you very easy to target. So you want to avoid that. You want to build about 5 to 10 meters below the crest of a hill. You also want to have good sight lines, a low profile, good heavy walls that can resist projectile fire, and good positioning. You want to be able to have a good line of sight to the approach. You want a low profile so that you're harder to target. You want heavy walls so if someone does start shooting at you, it's not just going to go right through the drywall. And you want good positioning. You want to not be flanked. You want to be set up in a position that you can defend. Your house needs to be warm. Probably the most critical component for this is good insulation. Insulating the house well, no matter what heating system you use, will save you money, because you're losing less heat to the outside, so you need less heat put in. Secondly, you want an efficient and effective heating source. Fire resistant. This one is really important. Fire can be absolutely devastating in the absence of a fire department to come and save you. And frankly, even with a fire department, fires can still be devastating. To prevent fire, you want to minimize the amount of flammable material, especially around your hearth, and keep a fire extinguisher handy. You also want to keep an eye on your trash pile, because rot equals hot. Rotting things produce heat. Remember that will be important later. And lastly, you want your place to remain clean. You want to have safe and regular removal of waste to prevent the spread of disease. So where do you want to live? My recommendation would be living somewhere rural. And we're going to kind of go in order of, from kind of the most normal way to do that to the least normal way to do that, if that makes sense. The first of these is rural off-grid homesteading. i.e. moving out to a rural area now, buying a house, and living off the land on it. The reason I recommend living in a rural area, the big advantage is that land is cheap. You may have heard the three most important factors in property values: location, location, location. Land is crazy cheap out in rural areas. For example, this house here, 3833 Brandon Mountain Road in Rochester, Vermont. I have seen this house. I have driven by this house. It's a wonderful little historic home, 4,000 square feet. It's a 5-bed, 3-bed house on 8 acres, and it is selling for $135,000. It was listed for $135K. That is absurdly cheap for that. By comparison, my partner's mother lives in Natick in about an 1,800 square foot 3-bedroom house on like a quarter of an acre, and that house is probably worth about $400,000 because it's in Natick. Living out in the middle of nowhere and off the grid, you can still have all of your modern conveniences, and in fact, it's actually easier and cheaper to have a luxury off-grid home than to live like a Spartan in the city, because, again, location. Most importantly to living out in a rural area is that you'll be able to feed yourselves without external infrastructure. It's very difficult to garden in a city. Cities are, by their nature, colonial structures. They require a large swath of land to be under its control to import food and other resources. If you live out in the rural areas where that food is produced, you don't need that external infrastructure. You don't need truckloads of food coming into the city, into your area every day. It's also easy to lay low in the middle of nowhere. It's easier to disappear, to lay low where there's not a CCTV camera on every street corner. This is a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because this also means that you're going to need to be able to protect yourself rather than being able to rely on 911, assuming that you could call 911 in the first place, which many of us cannot. Out in the rural area, that is far more the case. You need to be able to protect yourself because 911 is going to be 45 minutes away. So let's say that you have land, but you don't have any structures on it. You're only able to afford to purchase land or to live on the land. You can't actually, there's no buildings on it. How can we build a structure expediently with local on-site resources? Well, the same way that our ancestors have done it for hundreds, if not thousands of years, building out of cob, stone, or logs. Cob is an earthen material. It's kind of like adobe. Stones, pretty self-explanatory, or logs, things that you can gather on site and assemble yourself. Local materials will reduce the cost of building a lot, allowing you to build shelters relatively quickly. A log cabin, for example, can be built, a suitable log cabin can be built for under $10,000, and you will have a dwelling, a shelter, for less than $10,000. Even less than that, depending on how much labor you do yourself versus contracting out. It may need to be rebuilt or maintained frequently, to prevent rot and deterioration, but the simple fact is that one of these structures can go up in a couple of weeks and you'll have a place to live. Lastly, if you really need to get out of Dodge quickly, a yurt or a tent might be a great option for you. This is for when you don't actually have land that you own, or land that you haven't built on but are building on and want to move to in the meantime to save money. It's quite simple. It's a tent. It takes a little while to fabricate a tent or a yurt, but once you're in place, it takes less than a day to set it up. A well-made yurt will be just as weatherproof as a permanent structure. I mean, yurts were used on the Mongolian steppes in one of the harshest climates on the planet for centuries, and they're quite comfortable. This can essentially be thought of as like a bug-out home. I don't like the kind of prepper concept of bugging out. I think it's a little dumb, but if you have no choice but to live in a densely populated area in the city, you're not working in a field, or you're not financially stable enough that you can reasonably expect to go out and, live off the grid. It's pretty easy to keep a tent or a yurt in the closet and then, if shit goes fanwards, to then relocate out to the middle of nowhere. Once you're out in the middle of nowhere, you need to stay warm. You need to heat your house and have a way to cook and all of that. So a wood stove is a great way to do that. They're a great way to heat temporary or expedient shelters like yurts or cabins due to their low cost and portability. A wood stove can be built with hardly anything more than some hardware and a 55-gallon drum, or they can be purchased for cheap on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. Wood stoves don't really deteriorate with age. It's an iron box. There's not a lot to go wrong there. It burns a lot more cleanly and efficiently than an open fireplace or an open campfire. And it's multi-use. You can use your wood stove for cooking as well as for space heating. Plus, they're just really nice. They're just so cozy. I spent a week back in 2018 up in a cabin with my friend Erin. Her grandfather owned some land and a cabin on it, and we spent a week up there just hanging around, and God, wood stoves are just really nice. However, they have a problem. Wood stoves need to be tended or there's no heat. If there's no fire in the box, there's no heat in the space. It's also a lot less efficient than some other forms of wood heating, such as the tile oven, also known as the masonry heater or the Russian stove. This is essentially a wood stove made out of bricks with a winding chimney lined with fire brick to capture heat. The idea behind this is that fire brick is much more of an insulator, and it is a much better thermal capacitor than steel or iron. Essentially, it can, the idea is that you have a short duration burn at a very high temperature. You can have a high temperature burn because you're not overheating the room because, again, fire brick is an insulator. And you don't need to be burning it all the time because all of that heat will be captured in the stonework. And of course, a higher temperature burn is a more efficient burn. Tile ovens are typically 70 to 90% thermally efficient compared to about 40 to 60% for wood stoves. So, like I said, heat is retained in the stonework and released slowly. You only need, and like I said, short duration burn. You only need to light the firebox for an hour or two, and you can heat the room for the entire day or more. The problem is that it's not an instantaneous heat. It takes a little while to warm up. But if you're living here day in and day out, that's, of course, less of a problem. Depending on the design, a tile oven can actually heat several rooms, whereas a wood stove can only heat one. It can be, depending on, if you build your house around the tile oven, you can heat multiple rooms. You can integrate a water heater into the system, so you can have hydronic heating, radiator heating. The design is, as you can see, multi-use. You've got a cooking surface over on the right side, and indeed, you could even build furniture into this. You have a little bench over on the left you can sit on, and it's nice and toasty. However, there is a downside to tile oven, primarily weight and cost, which brings us to the rocket mass heater. This is essentially a cheaper and lighter version of a tile oven. It uses a rocket stove as its central heating element, which some of you may be familiar with if any of you are involved in camping, especially in ultralight camping. So the idea with this is that fuel is fed vertically into a horizontal combustion chamber. I have a diagram on the next slide, so you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. But essentially, this results in a more controlled burn because only one end of the fuel is burning, and it burns. You feed in fuel as it's needed instead of burning the whole log at once. The combustion chamber and the chimney are insulated with cob, which I mentioned earlier as a building material. It is essentially packed earth or mud. It is like adobe. It's a lot lighter and easier to build with than fire brick. It doesn't require a mason to come in and build it. It's a lot lighter, so you don't need to reinforce the floor as you often do with a tile oven. A tile oven can easily cost $20,000 to install and require specialized labor, and you got to reinforce the floor because it's heavy. A rocket mass heater has none of these problems. And in some designs, it even manages to provide quick heat because, as you can see, there's an exposed barrel that's part of the heating system, part of the exhaust system. The only reason that rocket mass heaters aren't really more used is because they are a new technology. They're relatively recently developed. Here's a diagram showing how a rocket mass heater works. As you can see, the fuel magazine is vertical while the combustion chamber is horizontal, so you're only burning whatever fuel is needed. You have a very lean fuel-to-air mixture. You then route the exhaust, the chimney, through a nice big thermal mass to collect all your heat. So what if you don't want to burn things because, I don't know, you just hate yourself and don't like a wood fire for some reason? Well, there's another option. As I mentioned earlier, decomposing organic material produces heat. Rot equals hot. If you've ever driven by a municipal compost pile, you may have seen this. If you've driven by a municipal composting facility, you've seen it giving off steam in the dead of winter. They can regularly achieve temperatures of 110 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is plenty hotter than a typical shower. So the idea that one French farmer and forestry manager by the name of Jean Pain had, was to use his compost pile as his water heater. You route water pipe through your compost pile and pump water through, and the water is heated and you now have hot water. Depending on the design of your pile, you can get 12 to 18 months of hot water essentially for free off of the scrub cuttings of 1 acre of sustainably managed woodland. That scrub will then take about 5 years to grow back, so 5 acres of woodland gives you functionally infinite hot water for free forever. Depending on the design, you can also harvest natural gas from this pile, which is very useful. Natural gas is another great fuel to use for cooking and other services. An important note about electricity, because we're going to get into electrical production in a moment. The thing is, we don't need electricity. We need services. We don't need electric lighting. We need light. We don't need, electrically powered video games. We need entertainment. We don't need electricity to power, power tools or other devices. We need those devices to work. We need the mechanical advantage that they offer. Electricity can provide those services, but it is always worth thinking outside the box to consider other ways to get them. For example, as I just mentioned, tools using direct transmission of mechanical power instead of electrical generation to power a tool. If you have, a drill press, then instead of having an electric drill press driven by a windmill's generator, just connect the drive shaft of the windmill directly to your drill press. Or instead of refrigeration, using root cellaring or pickling to preserve food. That said, electricity is really useful and kind of easy to get and nice to have. How do we get power when we're off the grid, when we're not connected to city mains? Because, again, city mains, not resilient and not autonomous. If something disrupts your main's power, then you're out of power. Solar panels are the current vogue. They're cheap due to government subsidies and a growing economy of scale where, more and more people are using them, so people are manufacturing them on a larger scale. So that's making them cheaper. The problem with photovoltaic solar panels is that they are not at all autonomous. They require rare earth materials and high-tech manufacturing, very energy intensive to manufacture photovoltaic solar power. However, that's not to say that solar is dead. We can use a solar mirror. This is low-tech solar. This is this is the first image you see up top. This is reflecting sunlight onto a single point, which can then either run a heat engine or heating water to turn a generator. If we don't live in as quite as sunny a climate as we'd like, reflective solar works great in Arizona, but maybe not so great up in Vermont. But up here in Massachusetts and Vermont and New England, we have a lot of wind. Windmills are an older method of generating energy. They can be used to power mechanical devices directly, or to generate electricity or even thermal energy. They have trigeneration, what's called multi-generation capability. You can, run a generator off them to produce electricity. You can power mechanical devices directly from the drive shaft, or with an oversized brake system, produce heat. Small water turbines can be used very similarly to windmills. They are location dependent. You need, what's called a head of water. You need essentially a source of water pressure of moving water, like a river or a waterfall or a reservoir at high altitude. But they can run similarly to windmills. Now, once you have power, you need to store it. Now, typically, again, that is with batteries, either lead-acid batteries or lithium-ion. There are advantages to this. Batteries are really power dense. They're really easy. There's a lot of literature and expertise already out there on how to use battery systems at home. They're very power dense. This guy's battery bank here probably stores enough power for his whole house for several days. And they're efficient. Electric to electric efficiency, i.e., electrical power into electrical power out of a battery, ranges between about 60% for lead acid and 90% for lithium ion. So, you put 1 kilowatt hour in, and you'll get between 0.6 and 0.9 kilowatt hours out, which is pretty damn good. However, batteries have a problem. They have a limited service life. They need to be replaced regularly. They can't be repaired or recycled easily. They are not autonomous. You can't, build one of these by yourself. Because they require high-tech manufacturing and rare resources to make. However, there's another method of energy storage, which is compressed air energy storage. This is kind of a new and old idea. This was very briefly used at the start of the Industrial Revolution. Pneumatic systems were used similar to hydraulic systems before electricity really started becoming a thing. The idea behind this is to essentially use your excess power to run an air compressor, and then to run that compressed air, to depressurize it through a diffuser to turn a generator to get power out. There's some precedent for this on on grid scale energy storage using expended gas and oil wells. The advantages to a case system are numerous. First off, they last a lot longer. While a battery system typically requires replacement every 5 to 10 years, depending on usage and what kind of batteries they are, a case system can easily last for 20 or 40 years. And they can be repaired or recycled with a local manufacturing base. You can take one of these down to a local, mechanic or a hardware store or a blacksmith and get it fixed. It's a metal tank. It's not super difficult to work with. This makes them both more resilient and more autonomous. The disadvantage is an inverse relationship between power density, discharge rate, and efficiency. So what does that mean? Essentially, you will either need a very large tank to store power, or you will need a lot of generation capacity. A case system, in order to store enough power to run your house for a day, you can either have a very large, efficient system or a very small, inefficient system. You can either have a system the size of a battery pack system that'll fit in your closet, but the electric-to-electric efficiency is only about 20% because of thermal losses with, compressing air tends to heat up air, and that's where a lot of the energy goes. Or if you have a more efficient system, 60 to 70% efficiency, electric to electric, it needs to be the size of a garage. So either you need a large tank or a lot of uptime on your generation. However, this efficiency problem is mitigated greatly by the fact that case systems also have multi-generation capacity. You can use compressed air to run air tools directly. You don't need to use it for electricity. You can just run it through air tools. Or you can use it for tri-generation of heating, cooling, and electricity. Because, like I said, when you compress a gas like air, when you compress compressible fluids into a smaller volume, their temperature increases. You get thermal energy, so there's your heating. When it expands, it cools. There's your cooling. And, of course, electricity as well. Calculated this way, taking tri-generation into account, case systems can achieve up to 80% efficiency, which is much better. Now, once you've got a place, and you've got your friends, and you've got your food, you need to get around, presumably. You can't necessarily just stay in one place. If the coronavirus pandemic has taught me anything, it's that staying inside for weeks on end will drive you crazy. So, we're mostly going to focus on cars, on automotives. Beasts of burden, we're going to kind of skip over. That's really more of an animal agriculture thing anyway. Because cars will probably be around long enough. Great evidence for that is in Cuba. Cuba has had practically no car imports since 1959. Because of the American embargo on the island, Cuba really did not get a lot of cars. Through the Cold War, they got some Russian cars, and through more recently, they've been getting some Chinese and Korean imports, but most of it is old Detroit iron. And American car culture might very well look like Cuba by the end of our lifetimes. I don't think it's impossible to suggest that by the end of our lifetimes, old car manufacturing might be essentially dead in the water, and everyone's car is going to be a custom special, just like in Cuba. So as to what you should get, my advice is to ignore prepper car wisdom, especially from like Instagram influencer types. What I mean by this is that there's a very common trope in prepper circles of avoiding computerization in cars, because those computers are unreliable. The idea that they're unreliable, that they're finicky, and they won't work when you need them to, and you can't fix them, which isn't really accurate. That kind of thinking is rooted, I would say, probably about 10% in boomers being unable to comprehend how computers work, and about 90% in the late Cold War, which was kind of the genesis of modern preppers, of prepperism. The modern survivalist movement really has its roots in the late Cold War in the late 80s and early 90s, at a time when computerization in cars really did suck. And they were concerned primarily with a nuclear war, and radiation will fry computers, and if your car needs computers to run, then you no longer have a car. There's a lot more on this in the useful notes sheet that I have attached. But my point is that that attitude is no longer really accurate. The fact of the matter is that in modern cars, computerization and electrification of the cars has actually made them more reliable, more capable, and easier to maintain. I would also recommend that you don't overbuy. You see a lot of preppers, if you ever check prepper forums or whatever and look at what they're considering for quote-unquote bug-out vehicles, you'll notice that they're buying things like ex-military Humvees or, the deuce and a half, 2.5 ton trucks. These things that'll run on anything that burns, and they'll carry 5,000 pounds of stuff over any terrain, or they're spending, $80,000 on roided out Jeep Wranglers. You don't need that, is my point. You don't need that, and you shouldn't get that, because you're wasting your time and money. First off, you're wasting time and money. Secondly, you're painting a big target on your back. If you drive around in a military Humvee, what that announces to the world is, I have a dramatically overinflated sense of my own ability to win a fight, and shit worth stealing. Please mug me. And because of a simple engineering fact that all of engineering is compromises, a military Humvee is a great off-roader, but it's unreliable, and it's not efficient, and it's huge, and it's not very space efficient on the inside. There's a lot of trade-offs in buying one of these very specialized, very kind of roided out prepper cars. So my recommendation is don't overbuy. All you really need in terms of your car's capability, you need something that will run reliably and economically, that will haul you, your friends, and your stuff, and that will be able to get over what I call Vermont road capability. Will you be able to get up a dirt road uphill in winter? And the answer is, if you have snow tires, yes, you will. Even without four-wheel drive, although that's a good option to have. I want to talk briefly about two-wheel death machines, also known as motorcycles. Motorcycles, mopeds, and bicycles offer a lot of advantages over cars. They're a lot more maneuverable. They're a lot more economical, and they're a lot easier to work on. Bikes, if I were living in Boston, I lived in Roxbury for a little over a year. If I were still living in Roxbury today, I would absolutely have a motorcycle on hand as my kind of getting out of Dodge vehicle. Because, when traffic, you've seen Boston traffic, when that's backed up and you need to get out of a city, well, what goes between cars? Motorcycles. They're a lot more economical. A typical motorcycle will be getting above 40 miles a gallon. Some bikes get up into the 60s, some are down in the 30s, but all of them run very efficiently. And they're really easy to work on because, as you can see on this Kawasaki KLR 650 here in this photo, It's all right there. There's nothing's tucked under or around anything else. Nothing's under a bunch of plastic covering. It's just all right there. And if you can get the bike up on jack stands, you can work on just about anything on it. The disadvantage is pretty obvious. First off, that they're not safe and that they can't carry much. I can't even qualify that statement. Motorcycles are not safe. You are 40 times more likely to die in a motorcycle accident than in a car accident. Now, of course, your odds of dying in either is pretty low, but your odds of winding up in the hospital from a motorcycle accident are pretty significant. My old man, for example, my dad has ridden motorcycles for most of his adult life. He's been in a couple of car accidents, I believe, throughout his life. Has he? He's never been hospitalized from a car accident. He was hospitalized from a motorcycle accident. He broke a collarbone once. And of course, they can't carry much. As you can see, you've pretty much got room for your ass and a duffel bag, and that's pretty much it. So overall, they're really great as kind of a backup vehicle, as a scouting vehicle, or like a getting out of Dodge vehicle if you live in a densely populated urban area, like inside of I-95, and you want to be able to get out of Dodge quickly. But it probably shouldn't be your primary or your only vehicle. It's also important to note that motorcycles are a lot more specialized than cars. You can take a Porsche 911 up a dirt road in Vermont and reasonably expect it to be okay. It's not going to be happy, but it'll still drive. You're not going to, spin out and end up upside down in a ditch. If you tried that on a Yamaha R6, that's less the case. Bikes are very specialized. Sport bikes are sport bikes. They really like to be on pavement. Dirt bikes are dirt bikes. They don't like being on pavement. However, there exist a couple of classes of motorcycle called the Scrambler or the Dual Sport bike that are kind of good on both. The KLR 650 is a great example of this. Now, once you have something, you need to fuel it. You need to be able to keep it running. That's the biggest concern for, just the most cursory kind of expectation of preparing for the apocalypse is, well, I have my car, but I need to keep it running. Great option for that is fuel alcohol. You can convert a gasoline engine to run on pure ethanol. It requires some modification to your engine and fuel delivery system, but it is doable. This is one of the big advantages to computer-controlled cars. You don't need to modify the fuel or timing systems on your car. If you're driving like a 1960 whatever, if you're converting a 1963 Ford Falcon to run on fuel alcohol, you need to manually adjust the fuel delivery. You need to adjust the carburetor and rejet the carburetor and the engine timing, because ethanol burns both colder and more slowly than gasoline, which means, it has less energy density. So, it had a gallon of ethanol has less energy in it, less chemical energy in it than a gallon of gasoline, and it burns slower. So you need to advance the engine timing and put more fuel in the engine to run similarly. However, even in computer-controlled systems, you're going to need to do some modification because ethanol is a really great solvent, and it tends to corrode a lot of natural rubber components, and those will need replacing. To produce it, this is essentially just really high-proof moonshine. This is fermenting and distilling, and it's legal to do in the United States. You can get a permit for distilling fuel alcohol from the ATF for free. Ethanol has some cold starting problems. Most biofuels do. With ethanol in particular, it just doesn't really like to vaporize at low temperatures, so you might have some difficulty cold starting your engine in very cold temperatures. The more commonly known biofuel, and the one with the most support and knowledge around it, is biodiesel. Biodiesel is also easier to run a petroleum diesel engine on biodiesel than to run a petroleum gasoline engine on ethanol. That's also an advantage. The operating principle of producing homebrew biodiesel is called transesterification. Essentially, you have a fatty acid, and you're replacing the glycerin chain, the long glycerin chain in fatty acid, with a shorter hydrocarbon, which makes it less viscous and more likely to combust. The inputs for this essentially in layman terms, what you need to know. The inputs are filtered vegetable oil, a heat source, some methanol to provide those hydrocarbons, and a catalyst, namely lye. And the products you get out of this are glycerin, which you can then use to make soap, and methyl esters, also known as biodiesel. Biodiesel, like all biofuels, doesn't really do too well in the cold. It tends to slush. So you're going to want a block heater if you have a diesel motor that you're planning to run on biodiesel. The last and to me most interesting form of biofuel is wood gasification. The idea here, you can run a car on wood. This is not a joke. The idea here, you're basically producing charcoal. You're heating wood in a limited oxygen environment. This releases wood gas. It's a mix of hydrogen and methane and carbon monoxide, which is combustible. Essentially, that's what wood is. It is these chemicals, and with limited oxygen and heat, they break off from the solid form and create a gas. You can then run into an internal combustion engine, and combust. You need no modification to the engine to do this, just run the gas in. There is precedent for this. Wood gasifiers were very popular in parts of Europe during the Second World War, where petroleum was heavily rationed and people still needed to get around, so they built wood gasifiers. It then gained some traction in the United States during the 1970s. And it's actually even used today in North Korea because they have very limited petroleum resources. Some of their military trucks run on wood gas. The advantages to this is that it's a lot safer, a lot cheaper, and a lot simpler than homebrewing biodiesel or fuel alcohol. If you have an axe and a saw, you can go collect wood. You don't need to work with any relatively dangerous procedures like distilling or producing biodiesel. The disadvantage is that wood gasifiers are heavy, they're inconvenient to operate, and they're kind of dirty. They're really heavy. This, as you can see here on Wayne Keith's Dodge Dakota, which he's been running on wood since 2004, it takes up a lot of space. They're not super convenient to operate because the reactor, the biological reactor that's producing the wood gas, needs to heat up, and it takes about 10 minutes from heating that up to when you can actually start the engine. And simply working with wood is dirty. If you've ever used any kind of wood heating, you know this. You just kind of tend to get flakes of sawdust on everything. And, of course, since you're producing carbon monoxide as a combustible gas, a leak in that system is very dangerous. So it kind of needs to be in an open air thing. So it's really only viable on pickup trucks, utes, or on trailers. That said, it's really damn cool, and I really love wood gas. So what conclusions are we taking from all of this knowledge? Conclusion number 1 is personal preparedness. Have useful skills. Develop useful skills. Know how to maintain the things that you have or to make new ones. Learn how to change the oil in your car or how to patch a hole in clothing. You don't need to be totally self-sufficient. Nobody is. But you should know 1 or 2 useful skills. These are good things to learn. You can start learning today, and you should. You can make a hobby out of these, out of gardening, or out of shooting, or out of working on cars. And I very strongly recommend it, because your knowledge will enable the survival of your group. Conclusion 2, and I think this is really a very important one, is logistics. With any of your solutions, any of the life ways that you're adopting, any of the solutions to the problems of providing for ourselves, always think of your big 3. Resilient, sustainable, autonomous. Can you do this forever? Can you do this yourself? Can you do this through a changing society? Refer to our collective ancestors for knowledge and ideas. People have lived and have fulfilling and healthy lives before the advent of modern industry, and a lot of people still do even without it. It's also important to bear in mind that high tech doesn't necessarily mean better. Progress is a myth. All of engineering is compromises. Know your actual needs and think laterally and low tech to meet them. Conclusion number 3, and this one's very important for our mental health, our psychological health, is our mindset. we need to remember we cannot save the world, which means you don't have to bear the weight of saving the world. Do what you can, to be sure, but don't lie awake at night wondering if you should have done more. Modern communications have brought the whole world into our rooms and our pockets, and that can be overwhelming. My strong advice is to focus on your locality, on the people around you, on your friends, on your neighbors, on your family. Wars and uprisings and developments on the other side of the world, there's not a ton that you can do about. But people in your neighborhood, if there's a refugee family from Syria, or a friend just lost their job and they're getting evicted, and they need help, they're in your neighborhood and they need help, you can help them. You can do that yourself. And you'll have done 1,000 times more than any politician or political party ever has. We can survive and thrive through all of this, and the end of the world might not be such a bad thing. Lastly, I want to provide some additional resources and references. A lot of these have been referenced in the useful notes page that I also put out with this presentation. The first is Low Tech Magazine. They are a fascinating publication that I've been following for a couple of years that propose, old ideas as ways to fix modern problems and modern adaptations of older ideas. Secondly, I would recommend Jalopnik for anything to do with cars, car news, car reviews, car information, and especially car projects. A number of authors on the site have their own car projects where they, restore old Jeeps or whatever, which can really help gain an understanding of how cars work. I'd recommend subscribing to Mother Earth News. This is the oldest sustainable homesteading magazine in the United States. I follow them online, and I have a special edition copy sitting right here in my room that I've been reading. So if you want to learn anything about sustainable homesteading, about, home gardening, off-grid energy production, water production, alternative fuels, any of that, Mother Earth News is great for that. I follow a couple of channels on YouTube that you might find interesting. InRange TV, if you're interested in firearms at all, InRange TV is a great resource. They're very factual, they're non-political, which is good because unfortunately the firearms community tends to be. If you want to know anything about firearms, InRange is a great resource. I recommend Maximus Iron Thumper. Swear to God, that's his name on YouTube. He's a British off-gridder and blacksmith, and he's published a number of videos of his own home systems and how they all work. I recommend Primitive Technology. That's just a really relaxing YouTube channel to watch, but it also talks in great detail about, well, as the name implies, how to produce things like, shelter and fire and pottery with literally no more than hands and rocks. And lastly, I would recommend Chris Fix to learn how to repair cars. He's a great resource. He's published videos on how to do just about anything on a car. The United States government has published a lot of resources, a frankly disturbing amount of resources. You can buy the United States Army Improvised Munitions Handbook from Amazon for like $12. But of course, there's other resources as well, such as Nuclear War Survival Skills, published by the Oak Ridge National Laboratories. There's all kinds of government publications that I would recommend reading. FEMA actually maintains a brochure or a publication on how to build and operate a wood gas generator, because they want to be prepared for any eventuality, and one of those from FEMA's perspective is, well, how do we keep trucks full of food moving if there's no petroleum, if there's another oil crisis? I recommend a publication from the Anarchist Distribution Center, CrimethInc. They have a piece, Recipes for Disaster, an Anarchist Cookbook. I recommend Googling it. PDFs are available. It's a great guide to all kinds of direct action, including some very useful skills for supporting oneself, for living outside of civilization. My email is right here. It's jedelman1129@gmail.com. You can email me with questions if you'd like. And lastly, really just a lot of Googling random shit like 2:30 in the morning. You would be amazed on what you can find on survivalist forums and the like. I have an entire folder in my bookmarks with like 60 something pages bookmarked of self-sustainable, self-sustained living items that I just found from like Googling all kinds of random questions. I would strongly recommend just do a lot of that. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope y'all found this informative.